The spaceship landed on planet Keplorifor for 2B, with a soft hum that vibrated through the metal floors and into the bones of everyone. Aboard, Jake Harrison checked the atmospheric readings on his console and nodded to his team of 5 other humans, who had traveled 8 light-years to establish first contact with an alien civilization that had been sending radio signals toward Earth for the past decade. The alien planet stretched before them through the viewport with purple skies and crystalline mountains that caught the light of twin suns and cast rainbow reflections across valleys, filled with bioluminescent vegetation that pulsed like a heartbeat. Commander Lisa Monroe stood at the front of the ship and studied the landing zone, where a group of alien beings waited near a structure that looked like it was grown rather than built, with organic curves and living walls that seemed to breathe. The aliens themselves were humanoid in shape, but taller than any human, with skin that shifted between shades of silver and blue depending on the light, and their eyes were large and luminous, with vertical pupils, like cats, and they wore garments that seemed to be made from the same living material as their buildings, flowing and adjusting to their movements as if the clothing had its own awareness. Jake was the linguist on the mission, and he had spent months learning the basics of their language from the radio transmissions, but nothing could prepare him for the moment. Opened, and he stepped onto alien soil for the first time, breathing air that tasted like honey and electricity, while his heart hammered in his chest with equal parts fear and excitement. Alien delegation approached with smooth, graceful movements, and at their front walked a female who stood nearly 7 feet tall, with flowing silver hair that moved like water down her back, and her eyes locked onto Jake with an intensity that made him freeze in place as she stopped just inches from him and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes and thunder combined. She said something in her language that the translator device clipped to his collar struggled to process before finally producing words that made Jake blink in confusion, because she had said, "Welcome visitors from the small blue world. We have prepared a feast to celebrate your arrival, and we hope to learn much from you, as you will learn from us." Lisa stepped forward and extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting, but the alien female looked at the hand with curiosity before reaching out and grasping Lisa's forearm instead, in what must have been their own greeting custom. And then she did the same to Jake, who felt the coolness of her skin and the surprising strength in her grip as she held his arm and studied his face with those luminous eyes. The alien female, whose name was something that sounded like Zara when translated, led the human team through the living city, where buildings grew from the ground, like trees, and pathways shifted beneath their feet to guide them toward their destination. And everywhere they looked, alien citizens stopped to stare at the humans with the same curiosity that the humans felt toward them. They arrived at a great hall that opened to the sky, with tables that seemed to grow from the floor already, laden with foods that looked both familiar and completely alien, with fruits that glowed softly and meats that still seemed to move slightly on the plates and vessels, filled with liquids that changed color as they watched. Zara gestured for the humans to sit, and the team exchanged nervous glances before taking their places at the table, while their alien hosts arranged themselves across from them, and Zara sat directly opposite Jake, with her eyes never leaving his face, in a way that made him both uncomfortable and strangely flattered. The feast began with Zara explaining each dish through the translator, though some concepts did not translate well, and she would pause and try different words until the humans understood, and Jake found himself drawn into conversation with her about Earth and human culture, while she told him about her world and her people, who called themselves the Varanowers. Passed, and the other humans engaged with other Varani, while Jake and Zara continued their exchange, and he noticed that she leaned closer as they spoke, and her hand would occasionally brush against his arm or shoulder in gestures that seemed deliberate to be accidental, and he wondered if he was misreading the situation or if something else was happening beneath the surface of this diplomatic dinner. Finally, as the meal wound down, Zara stood and asked Jake to walk with her through the gardens that surrounded the hall, and he glanced at Lisa, who gave him a small nod of approval, before he rose and followed the tall alien female out into the bioluminescent night, where plants glowed in shades of blue and green, and the air hummed with the sounds of alien insects. They walked in silence for a while, until they reached a quiet grove, where a fountain bubbled with liquid that sparkled like stars, and Zara turned to face him with an expression that the translator could not capture, but that Jake somehow understood as serious and important she spoke, and the translator rendered her words as Jake of Earth. I have enjoyed our conversation greatly, and I find your species fascinating in ways that go beyond mere scientific curiosity. And I wish to propose something that may seem unusual to you, but is a great honor among my people, Jake. Felt his pulse quicken as he waited for her to continue, and she moved closer until he had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact with her towering form, and she said, among the Varani, when we find another being who we connect with on multiple levels, we engage in a bonding ritual that joins our genetic material and creates offspring that carry the best traits of both parents and I believe that you and I could create something remarkable together. The translator had processed her words, but Jake's brain struggled to catch up as he realized what she was proposing, and he stammered, trying to find the right words to respond, while his face flushed hot with embarrassment and confusion, and he finally managed to say, I think there has been a misunderstanding because I suggested we share a meal together to learn about each other and build friendship between our species. Tilted her head in a gesture that might have been confusion or amusement, and she replied, I understood your meaning perfectly, Jake of Earth, and I am proposing something more than friendship, because among my people sharing a meal is often the first step toward sharing genetic material and creating new life, and I find you suitable for this purpose in every way that matters to my king. Jake took a step back and held up his hands and said, I am honored truly, but humans do not bond so quickly. And we have many customs around reproduction that involve long periods of courtship and emotional connection, and besides, I am not even sure if humans and Varani are biologically compatible for such a things. Zara's expression shifted to something that looked like disappointment mixed with determination, and she said, Our scientists have already studied your biology from the scans we took when your ship entered our atmosphere, and we are compatible enough that with some medical assistance, we could produce viable offspring. And as for courtship, I have been courting you all evening with my attention and my gifts of food and knowledge. The situation had spiraled far beyond Jake's training for first contact, and he felt panic rising in his chest as he tried to think of a diplomatic way to refuse without offending an alien species that humanity desperately wanted to maintain good relations with, and he said, Zara, I need time to think about this and to discuss it with my commander, because this is not a decision I can make alone. Ara regarded him for a long moment before nodding slowly, and she said, I understand that your kind moves more slowly than mine, but know that my offer stands, and among my people it would be considered a rejection of great honor to refuse such a proposal without serious consideration, and I hope you will give it the thought it deserves. They walked back to the great hall in awkward silence, and when they rejoined the others, Lisa immediately noticed the tension between them and pulled Jake aside to ask what had happened, and when he explained the situation in hushed, urgent tones, her eyes went wide and she muttered something about this being above her pay grade before saying she would need to contact Earth for guidance. The human team was given quarters in the living city, where rooms grew from the walls at their request and provided soft sleeping surfaces and facilities that approximated their needs, and Jake lay awake most of the night staring at the ceiling that pulsed with soft light while he processed everything that had happened and wondered how a simple diplomatic mission had turned into an alien marriage proposal. The next morning brought a message from Earth that had taken hours to arrive due to the distance, and the response from command was essentially a long, complicated way of saying that the decision was Jake's to make, but they strongly encouraged him to consider the diplomatic implications of his ways. Choice and the potential benefits of human Varani hybrid offspring for both species. Jake felt the weight of that responsibility crushing down on him as he dressed and prepared to face another day of negotiations and cultural exchange, and when he emerged from his quarters, he found Zara waiting for him with an expression of patient expectation that made his stomach not with anxiety. She greeted him formally and said that she had spoken with her people's council, and they had agreed to give him one full cycle of their planet to make his decision, which translated to about 30 Earth hours, and she promised not to pressure him further but hoped he would spend the time